At 19, she was forced to marry the cold Duke, but on the wedding night he whispered her father's last wish. The morning church bells tolled with a sound like thunder trapped in stone. Clara Everden knelt in the vestry, her white silk gown catching the weak December light that pressed through the chapel windows, a gown that had cost her guardian nothing, which was precisely why it trembled upon her shoulders. She was 19, unmarried 2 hours ago, Duchess now, by signature and silence. The vicar had spoken the binding words with the careful circumspection of a man who understood that this union was not born of love, and society hungered to know why. He had rushed through the vows as though haste alone could purify the occasion. The congregation, a careful mixture of county nobility and curious parish folk, had watched not the bride and groom, but each other, trading glances, heavy with implication. No dowry had been announced. No family friends stood as witnesses beyond the legal minimum. The Duke himself, Rowan Harrowby, had appeared at the altar with the bearing of a man accepting a sentence, his jaw set, his eyes fixed upon the prayer book, as though it alone held truth. Clara had felt the weight of 1,000 invisible judgments settle upon her shoulders as she walked down the aisle. Poor girl, unpurchased bride. What is the connection? What has compelled him? The whispers had begun before her father's headstone was cold. Now, in the vestry, a woman's hand, the housekeeper's, Mrs. Thorne, adjusted the lace of her veil with the kind efficiency that spoke of pure duty without warmth. "You are His Grace's Duchess now, Miss Clara," Mrs. Thorne said quietly, not looking into her eyes. "The household will address you accordingly. There are expectations." Expectations. The word hung like a threat. Clara smoothed the seam of her glove, a gesture born from childhood that always preceded her most difficult moments. "What sort of expectations, Mrs. Thorne?" Her voice was steady, though her fingers ached. The housekeeper's lips pressed into a thin line. She was a woman of perhaps 50, austere as winter slate, with eyes that seemed to hold a ledger of every secret in Harrowby House. "His Grace has not been married before, miss. The household is curious about the arrangement. Some have wondered if this marriage was necessary." The implication hung unspoken. "Was there scandal? Are you with child? Are you of suitable station?" Clara's chin lifted slightly. She had been raised by a provincial physician, a learned man of excellent character, modest fortune, and no social brilliance. When her father had died 6 months prior, leaving her with almost nothing, she had learned that the world did not care for a woman's education or virtue if her circumstances could not match. Society needed a narrative, and they had found one. The Duke's charity, the Duke's peculiar choice, the Duke's something dark, bride. The sealed letter, still in her reticule, seemed to pulse against her side. "Mrs. Thorne," Clara said quietly, turning to face the older woman fully, "I am here because His Grace has honored a commitment. I do not know the nature of that commitment, nor do I require the household's understanding of it. I shall conduct myself with dignity in whatever role His Grace has determined for me." Something, perhaps respect, perhaps merely surprise, flickered across Mrs. Thorne's face. The journey to Harrowby House had taken most of the day. The estate rose from the moorland like a dark crown, stone upon grey stone, windows that seemed to watch rather than welcome. Clara had expected coldness from the architecture. She had not expected it from the man who stood waiting in the great hall as she descended from the carriage. The Duke was perhaps 35, tall and composed, with the kind of controlled silence that made one feel one's own breathing too loudly. He wore dark wool, a waistcoat of bottle green, and an expression of absolute professional courtesy. When he had extended his hand to guide her down the carriage steps, it had been gloved, and the touch lasted no longer than politeness required. "You have travelled safely, madam," he said. "Not a question, an observation." "I have, Your Grace. Thank you for the escort." He had inclined his head, and that had been the sum of their wedding day conversation. Now as Clara entered the dining room for their first supper as husband and wife, she understood why the parish whispered. The Duke sat at the far end of a table that could have seated 20 and made no movement to alter the distance. The candles cast his face into shadow and illumination by turns, making him appear almost as a stone monument to some forgotten era. Clara sat at the opposite end, the distance stretching between them like accusation. "The household is prepared to attend to any needs, madam," he said, his voice travelling the length of the table with formal precision. "Mrs. Thorne will show you the apartments tomorrow. You have complete authority over the household matters of your choosing. I trust you will find everything in order." Every word was careful, measured, almost deliberately distant. It was the kind of speech one might give to a foreign diplomat, not a bride. "Thank you, Your Grace," Clara replied. "The house is beautiful." A brief pause. He looked at her, and in that moment his grey eyes held something, a flicker perhaps of something other than duty. It vanished before she could name it. "There is a matter," he said slowly, "that I must discuss with you this evening. It concerns your father." The sealed letter in her reticule seemed to burn. Clara's hand stopped mid-movement. "My father, Your Grace. He has been deceased nearly half a year." "I am aware," the Duke said quietly. "Nevertheless, after you have rested, I would like you to come to the library. There is something you ought to know." The servants moved around them, placing dishes, pouring wine, but Clara heard nothing except the strange gentleness in those final words, "something you ought to know," as though beneath the ice something human still dwelt. She held her breath, as she always did before truth, and waited for night to fall. The apartments assigned to Clara were on the eastern wing, facing the moors. They were beautiful in the way that money and taste could make something cold. Pale silk on the walls, a four-poster bed with damask hangings, wardrobes of polished mahogany. Everything was pristine, arranged with exactness, and utterly devoid of warmth. She had slept poorly, her mind circling the Duke's cryptic words, "something you ought to know." Her father had been a learned man, kind, but he had moved in modest circles. What possible connection could he have had with one of the highest nobility? The morning brought a surprise. A knock at her chamber door came early, too early for Mrs. Thorne's austere formality. Clara opened it to find a girl of perhaps 10 years, with pale chestnut hair in crooked braids, and an expression of profound shyness written across her small features. "I am Eleanor," the girl said, speaking so quietly that Clara had to lean closer. "But I am called Nell. I wished to... that is, I thought perhaps..." Her words dissolved into nervous silence. "Eleanor," Clara said gently, opening the door wider, "would you like to come in?" Nell hesitated on the threshold, as though crossing it might break some unspoken rule. When she finally entered, she kept to the edges of the room, her eyes moving from object to object with the intensity of someone cataloguing evidence. "You are His Grace's bride," Nell said finally, not a question. "I am," Clara confirmed, studying the child. She had the Duke's colouring, but her eyes were softer, uncertain. "Are you His Grace's sister?" "Ward," Nell said quietly. "My parents were his cousins. They died. He said I should have a home here. Sometimes I think he is sorry." She spoke with the directness of childhood, unburdened by the social courtesies that strangled adult conversation. "He is kind, but he forgets to show it. I think perhaps he does not know how." Clara found herself kneeling to the child's eye level. "Why do you tell me this?" "Because the household does not speak truthfully, madam. They whisper that you have trapped him somehow, or that he has taken you for an improper reason. But when I watched you in the chapel, you were afraid. Not cruel, just afraid like me." Nell's small hand reached out and touched Clara's sleeve. "I thought perhaps you did not know he is kind underneath. I wanted to tell you before the parish stories made you believe otherwise." Something within Clara's chest shifted, a small tremor, like the first crack in ice that has held for a long winter. "Thank you, Eleanor," she said. "That was very brave of you, and very kind." "Will you stay?" Nell asked with the simplicity of a child who has learned that people leave. The last housekeeper did, but she was sent away after only a month. The Duke said it was not her fault, but after she left he went even quieter than before. The weight of that statement, the small loneliness it contained, struck Clara with unexpected force. Before she could answer, footsteps sounded in the corridor. Nell's entire body went rigid. She stepped backward quickly toward the door. "I should not be here," she whispered. "He does not approve of... that is, he says the household should not gossip about him to you. I have already broken that rule." And with that confession, she slipped from the room like a shadow retreating from light. The day unfolded in formal compartments. Mrs. Thorne conducted Clara through the house's various domains, the morning room, the library, which made her pulse quicken, remembering the Duke's words, the music room where a piano stood in testament to an attention that never came. Everything was kept with obsessive precision, as though disorder might leak in at the seams if one were not vigilant. It was during afternoon tea that Canon Slade arrived. He was a thin man with a thin smile, and the kind of eyes that seemed to examine one like a ledger in need of audit. He had been the vicar at the wedding, and his presence in the drawing-room sent a chill through the servants' movements. "Mrs. Harrowby," he said, offering his hand with the gentleness of iron wrapped in silk. How delightful to find you settling into your new station. The parish is quite consumed with curiosity about the Duke's unexpected marriage. Clara took his hand briefly, feeling the precise temperature of it. The parish is kind to concern itself, Canon. Kindness, yes, he said, settling into the chair across from her, with the confidence of a man accustomed to his words being received as scripture. Though I confess, many of us were surprised. A match so sudden, without the usual announcements or courtship, without dowry, if I might be so candid. Some have wondered if there was a particular urgency to the arrangement. His smile did not waver. I am not aware of the nature of such wonderings, Canon, Clara said, her voice steady as she reached for her tea. The Duke chose to marry. I accepted the honor. Beyond that, I suspect the details are no one's affair but our own. Of course, he said, but his eyes lingered on her with an assessment that felt almost obscene. Still, one hopes that a young woman in your circumstances was not taken advantage of. Emotionally speaking, the Duke is known for his reserve. Some fear he may not be equipped to treat a tender bride with the affection such a role demands. The implication hung between them. I suspect impropriety. I am gathering evidence of scandal. His Grace has been nothing but honourable, Canon Slade, Clara said quietly. If you will excuse me, I have a prior engagement. She rose, and though it was deeply improper to leave a guest, she found she did not care. The Canon's questions had a scent to them, the scent of a man building a case against her, brick by brick. As evening approached, Clara found herself standing before the library door, her hand trembling slightly. The Duke was waiting. The library was cavernous, lined with volumes that had absorbed a century's worth of silence. A fire burned in the hearth, and beside it sat the Duke, a leather-bound ledger open before him. He rose when Clara entered, a gesture of courtesy that felt more complex than it should have been, a moment of acknowledgement that this room, this conversation, was a threshold of some kind. You have been here since this morning, he said without preamble, and already I believe the parish has begun its work. Canon Slade paid a call, Clara confirmed. His questions were not unkind in their phrasing, but their intent was clear. The Duke's jaw tightened visibly. He seeks scandal where none exists. Then perhaps, Your Grace, the scandal is in the secret itself. Clara moved toward the fire, warming her hands. The parish does not tolerate mysteries. They will invent explanations rather than endure unanswered questions. I am aware, the Duke said. His fingers moved along the edge of his signet ring, a gesture that suggested restraint barely held. This is difficult to explain, and yet explanation is owed. To you, primarily. To the household, secondarily. To the parish. He paused, and something almost like bitterness touched his mouth. To them, never. He gestured toward a chair near the fire. Clara sat. Your father, the Duke began, was acquainted with my father. A minor acquaintance, at the country level, but genuine. They met while your father was serving as physician to several families in the Shire. My father had occasion to consult him regarding a matter of significant delicacy. Clara's hands folded in her lap. I was not aware of this. You would not be. It was a private matter between gentlemen, but before your father died he wrote to me a letter. The Duke moved to a desk and withdrew an envelope, sealed with wax that bore her father's physician's mark, a small detail that suddenly made her throat tighten. He asked, in the event of his death, that I look after you, not with charity, he was explicit about this, but with the protection of a home, a position, a future that the world could not question. Clara could not find her voice. Your father was a man of extraordinary character, the Duke continued quietly. He knew that his death would leave you vulnerable, a woman of education but no fortune, in a society that prizes neither education nor virtue when fortune is absent. He asked that I marry you, madam, not for scandal's sake, but for your protection. The library seemed to tilt. He asked you to— It was not a request I granted lightly, the Duke said. There was something almost like pain in his voice. I am not a man who seeks a wife's companionship, nor do I offer affection readily. But when your father specified his dying wish, I understood it to be a charge of honor, the kind a man does not refuse. Something cracked open within Clara's chest, not anger, but something far more complex. Betrayal mingled with gratitude, resentment tangled with recognition. My father arranged my marriage without consulting me, she said slowly, without any choice in the matter. He did, the Duke acknowledged, and that was wrong by every modern standard of propriety. But by his standard, A standard I suspect you inherited. It was an act of desperate love. He was dying. He could not bear to leave you unprotected." Clara rose abruptly, moving away from the fire. "And you have married me out of obligation to a dead man. This house, this position, this—" she gestured at the space between them. "This distance between us is all dutiful constraint, nothing more." "It is," the Duke said, and there was such stark honesty in the statement that it nearly broke her. "And I apologize for it. I am not a man designed for affection, madam, but I am a man of my word. Your father asked for your protection, and you shall have it, utterly, completely, without reservation. The world may whisper, but they cannot touch you. That is a promise I made to him, and I make it now to you." Clara stood in the firelight, her mind spinning through implications. Her father, gentle, learned, helpless before the machinery of fate, had given her to this austere stranger as the only currency he possessed in the face of death, and the stranger had accepted not out of malice, but out of honor. "The canon suspects impropriety," she said after a long silence. "He will not rest until he has constructed a scandal." "Let him construct," the Duke said coldly. "I have the resources and the rank to silence him if necessary, but I will not permit him to damage your reputation. If it becomes necessary to announce the truth, that your father's dying wish was my marriage to you, I will do so, and society will accept it, because society bows before duty." "And us?" Clara asked, turning to face him fully. "What becomes of us caught in this arrangement?" The Duke's grey eyes met hers, and in that moment she saw something shift behind the controlled facade, something ancient and sorrowful, quickly shuttered. "That," he said quietly, "remains to be written." The evening deepened. The servants brought supper to the library. They ate in silence, but it was a different quality of silence than before. Less accusation, more contemplation. When Clara finally retired to her chambers, the sealed letter her father had written to the Duke remained in the library, and she knew it would become the weapon, or the shield, against the parish's hungry questions. Nell appeared at her door as midnight approached, carrying a glass of warm milk. "He was sad today," the child said simply. "Sadder than usual. I heard voices from the library. Did you quarrel?" "No, Eleanor," Clara said, accepting the milk and finding comfort in the gesture. "We simply came to understand each other." And it was true, she realized, though not in the way Nell meant. The days that followed took on a strange rhythm. Formal mornings and guarded afternoons, punctuated by Nell's unexpected visits. The girl had appointed herself Clara's unofficial guide to the household's hidden geometry, the unspoken hierarchies and small kindnesses that the staff offered when the Duke was not watching. It was Nell who showed her the library's secret alcove, where Rowan, she dared use his Christian name only to herself, kept a journal filled with the names and histories of every servant in his employ. It was Nell who revealed that Mrs. Thorne's severity masked a devoted loyalty, that the gardener often worked past twilight because the Duke had asked him personally to nurture certain winter flowers, and that every element of the household's precision was an attempt at creating order against an interior chaos that none of them fully understood. "He did not used to be so quiet," Nell confided one afternoon, curled upon the window seat of Clara's sitting room, watching the moors with the intensity of a child studying her own reflection. "When I first came here, he would read to me sometimes, not often, but sometimes. After a time he stopped. He said it was not appropriate that I must be taught to find my own company, but I heard him sometimes, in the library late at night, reading aloud to himself. Poetry, I think. Sad poetry." "Eleanor," Clara said carefully, "why are you telling me these things?" "Because you are sad too," Nell said matter-of-factly, turning from the window. "Different sadness than his, but sadness nonetheless. And I think perhaps if you both understood that you were sad in the same way, it might change something. I am not unhappy here, Eleanor." "That is not the same as happy," Nell replied with the logic of childhood. "When he looks at you, his eyes are different. Less like stone and more like someone trying to read a book in bad light. It is not romantic exactly, but it is something. And if you look at him when he is not watching, you look back at him the same way." Clara felt her cheeks warm. "Your Grace, your cousin, I should say, has married me out of duty to my father's dying wish. Nothing more." "That is what he would tell himself," Nell said, returning her gaze to the moors, "because he is afraid. I think men must be afraid quite often, but they are taught to believe it is weakness to acknowledge it. So instead, they wear duty like armor. It was the kind of observation that should have been precocious coming from a 10-year-old, yet it fell from Nell's lips with the calm certainty of something she had been taught or had learned by watching closely. The situation escalated on a Thursday morning. A letter arrived from the canon, directed to the Duke, and though Clara could not read it directly, the tremors it caused in the household's carefully maintained equilibrium were immediate. Mrs. Thorne's lips pressed even thinner. The footman moved with heightened tension, and Rowan, she glimpsed him briefly as he emerged from the study where he had received the canon's letter, looked aged by fury. It was Nell who brought news at tea time. "The canon has written that there are rumors," she said, having overheard a conversation between servants in the corridor. "He says that the marriage was improper, that you were traded to the Duke as compensation for debt, that your father was not a respectable man but a fortune hunter of some kind. He has challenged the Duke to either publish the marriage contract or face the suggestion of scandal." Clara's teacup froze mid-journey to her lips. "Where did you hear this, Eleanor?" "Mrs. Thorne was speaking to the cook," Nell said without shame. "I was in the pantry, they did not see me. You should not eavesdrop." "No," Nell agreed readily. "But if I had not, you would not know, and then it would surprise you unpleasantly. This seems better." Before Clara could respond, the Duke's voice came from the doorway. "Eleanor, you are dismissed." His tone was not unkind, but it was absolute. Nell gathered herself and departed with remarkable swiftness, though not before squeezing Clara's hand, a gesture that felt like a secret passed between conspirators. "The canon has overstepped," Rowan said without preamble. "He has taken the speculation of the parish and transformed it into accusation. He is demanding proof of the marriage's legitimacy." "Does he have the authority?" Clara asked, though she knew the answer. Society's judgment often transcended legality. "No, but public opinion is its own jurisdiction," the Duke said grimly. He moved to the fireplace and his fingers found that familiar place on his signet ring, the place where emotion was contained, held, prevented from becoming action. "I had hoped to protect you from the necessity, but it appears I cannot. I must publish your father's letter. It will silence the canon, and it will establish the legitimacy of our union. And my privacy?" "Sacrificed," the Duke said, and there was something almost gentle in his acknowledgement of the cost. "I am sorry, Clara, truly. Your father's most personal wishes, exposed to the parish and beyond, but the alternative is to allow insinuation to scar your reputation irreparably." She noted that he had used her given name, the first time since their wedding day. It was small and perhaps unintentional, but it felt like a brick being laid in a structure neither of them had planned. "Do what must be done," she said quietly, and she turned to watch the moors, where somewhere out there the world was constructing its narratives, and she was powerless to stop it. But perhaps, and this was the small warmth that Nell's words had kindled, perhaps she was not powerless to shape what came after. The letter was published in the Parish Gazette on Saturday. By Sunday, it had moved through the county like poison through water, slowly, thoroughly, and with consequences that could not be undone. The language was simple and devastating in its clarity. "To the Reverend Canon Peregrine Slade, and to the assembled parish of Harrowby." It was not Rowan who had written it, Clara realized immediately upon reading it. It was her father's own hand, preserved and reproduced, a voice speaking from beyond death, with the authority of truth. He detailed the nature of his final illness, the arrangements he had made for his daughter's welfare, and the honor he had conferred upon the Duke of Harrowby in trusting him with her protection. "I die knowing that my daughter shall have shelter, education, and the security of a respectable position. I know this man. I would not entrust my greatest treasure to one who was not worthy of that trust." The parish fell silent. Then it fractured into 1,000 competing narratives, but the dominant one had shifted. The Duke was no longer a predator. He was a man of honor. Clara was no longer a compromised bride. She was a testament to paternal love. Canon Slade did not appear at services the following day, but neither did anything repair itself in the way that public redemption might suggest. The damage had been done, not to reputation, but to privacy. The entire structure of their marriage, the arrangement and the duty was now known. People looked at Clara with a new kind of sympathy that felt almost patronizing, and they looked at Rowan with something like gratitude, as though he had done a remarkable thing rather than a dutiful one. The night of the publication, Clara found herself unable to sleep. She rose and went to the library, the room that had become the heart of their strange household, the place where truths were stored like precious and terrible things. Rowan was there, as though he had anticipated her. He was reading by the fire, and he did not start at her entrance. He merely set his book aside and gestured to the chair across from him. Not the formal distance of the dining table, but a proximity that suggested conversation was not merely permitted, but expected. "I could not sleep," she said. "Neither could I," he replied. "Your father's letter haunts me even now. I did not expect the power of his words, preserved and published to the world." "They were beautiful," Clara said softly. "And true, I think. He would have said those things to me had he lived long enough." "I believe he would have," the Duke said. He was looking at her with that quality of attention that Nell had described. Not romantic, but something akin to it. Something genuine, at least. "You remind me of him, you know. That same insistence upon truth even when it costs you dearly." "Is that a compliment, Your Grace?" "It is an observation," he said. "One that I suspect you will have need of in the coming months. The publication of your father's letter may have silenced the canon, but it has also made you visible to the world in a way that was not true before. There will be other tests, other moments, when your character will be scrutinized." "Then I shall endeavor not to disappoint," Clara said. "I did not doubt you would." He paused, and she watched his fingers find that place on his ring once again. "There is a matter I must discuss with you, Clara. A practical one, but also something more." She waited. "Your father's final letter to me, the one I have kept private, the one that specified his wishes regarding your future, contained language that has been weighing upon me since the day of our wedding." The Duke rose and moved to the desk where a second letter lay in a drawer. He did not open it. He merely held it, as though its weight alone might convey its significance. In it, he asked that I do more than provide shelter. He asked that I offer you the possibility of respect, genuine respect, not the hollow courtesy society demands between a husband and wife. He asked that I treat you not as a burden to be managed, but as a person to be known. "That is a strange request to make of a complete stranger," Clara observed. "It is," Rowan agreed. "But then, your father was always a strange man in the best possible way. He did not think in the narrow channels that society prescribes. He thought in terms of what a person might become if given permission to do so. And have I been given that permission, Your Grace?" "You have," he said. "And moreover, there is something else you ought to understand about this marriage, Clara. As of this evening, it is no longer purely a matter of your father's deathbed wishes and my obligation to honor them." He set the letter down and looked at her fully, and in his grey eyes was something that might have been vulnerability, or might have been hope, or might have been some combination of the two. "It has become a matter of my own choosing as well," he finished quietly. The evening deepened around them. Outside, the winter dark pressed against the windows, and the single lamp in the long corridor, the lamp that witnessed the household's choices, burned steadily. Clara understood, in that moment, that the wedding night she had dreaded was no longer a matter of being claimed or violated, but of something far more complex, the possibility of genuine connection between two people who had been forced into proximity by fate and circumstance. The sealed letter, her father's legacy, had opened not just society's understanding, but something within both of them. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," the Duke said, "you have supper with me in the morning room, and we conduct ourselves as a married couple should. Not because society demands it, but because we choose to. We speak to each other truly. We allow the possibility of knowing one another. And on the wedding night, which you have been dreading, I shall come to your chambers and tell you the rest of what your father asked of me, the part that he asked me to tell you only when you had begun to trust me." Clara's heart moved in a way she could not quite name. "And if I do not come to trust you?" she asked. "Then the choice remains yours," the Duke said. "Your father's letter freed you from forced choice, Clara. That freedom is real, and it extends to this as well." She rose to leave, but paused at the door. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. "Good night, Clara," he replied, and something in the way he spoke her name suggested that this was the first true conversation they had ever had. As she climbed the stairs to her chamber, she thought of the sealed letter, of her father's last wishes, and of the man downstairs who had chosen to honor them not merely as obligation, but as the beginning of something that might, eventually, become genuine. The morning room, Clara discovered, was a place of quiet transformation. Where the formal dining hall stretched between them like an accusation, this smaller space invited proximity. Windows faced the eastern gardens, and on winter mornings the light came through pale and clear, softening the austere lines of the furniture. Rowan began appearing there for breakfast, a departure from the household's established rhythm that Mrs. Thorne noted with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been approval. He arrived in dark coats and waistcoats of deep bottle green, his hair still bearing the marks of having been dressed with water rather than pomade, giving him an almost vulnerable air of ordinariness that the formal library never permitted. "You have not slept well," he observed on the third morning, noting the faint shadows beneath Clara's eyes. "The house settles noisily," she replied, which was partly true. The other part, that she lay awake thinking of his promise of what else her father had asked of him, remained unspoken. "I shall ask the servants to oil the hinges," he said. "The sound of floorboards shifting should not disturb you." It was such a small thing, this attention to her comfort, that it struck her with disproportionate force. In her father's house, no one had thought to notice whether she slept well. She had simply been and had been expected to endure what came. By the second week, the breakfast table had become a place of genuine conversation. Rowan spoke of the estate's demands, the repairs needed on the tenant cottages, the accounts that required attention, the winter stores that must be carefully managed. Clara, with her father's training in the practical necessities of life, listened with genuine interest and occasionally offered observations born from watching her father navigate similar challenges on a smaller scale. "You have a mind for these matters," Rowan said once, regarding her with that quality of attention that was beginning to feel like a gift rather than scrutiny. "My father believed that women were not intellectually inferior to men," Clara replied, "merely less encouraged to use their intelligence openly. I have spent my life arguing against that limitation, first in my mind and latterly in practice." "And do you find it exhausting?" he asked. "The constant argument?" "Tremendously," she admitted, "but not so exhausting as surrendering it would be." Nell began appearing at these breakfast conversations with increasing frequency, drawn by the unusual circumstance of two adults actually speaking to each other rather than maintaining the polite fiction of companionship. She would perch on the chair beside Clara, offering observations that ranged from the profound to the absurdly practical. "Cook says the tenant at Blackwood Farm will lose his crop if the drainage is not repaired before spring," Nell mentioned one morning, dipping her toast in tea with the casual familiarity of a child who had learned her manners were less important than her honesty. "Cook mentioned this to you?" Rowan asked, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth. "I was listening in the kitchen," Nell admitted without shame. "As I do. But it seemed important, and you did not appear to know, so I told you." The Duke exchanged a glance with Clara, and in that moment something shifted between them, a shared understanding that Nell's unconventional methods of communication, while not to be encouraged, often arrived at truths that proper channels missed. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said. "I shall ride to Blackwood this afternoon." "May I come?" Nell asked immediately. "No," Rowan said, but gently. "There are matters that require discussion with the farmer directly. However," he looked toward Clara, "perhaps Mrs. Harrowby might take you to the library this afternoon. I believe she has not yet catalogued the estate's collections. You could assist her." It was transparent, and everyone present knew it, an excuse for Clara and Nell to have time together while he attended to business. But it was also kind, a recognition that Clara needed to build her own relationships within the household rather than merely accepting those arranged for her. That afternoon in the library, Nell spoke with an unusual gravity. "He does not trust people easily," she said, running her fingers along the spines of books. "His father was not a kind man. I have heard Mrs. Thorne speak of it. He was exacting and cold, and he demanded much of his Grace from a very young age. I think perhaps his Grace learned that showing weakness was dangerous, and so he learned not to." "Eleanor, you should not be discussing your cousin's private affairs," Clara said, though she did not move to stop her. "I know," Nell replied, "but you need to understand him, and he will not tell you himself because he does not know how to. So I must do it for him, because I love him, and I love you, and I think you might love him too, if you were permitted to." Clara felt her chest tighten. "What makes you believe I am beginning to love him?" "Because you listen to him," Nell said simply. "When he speaks, you do not merely hear words. You hear the person underneath them. That is what love is, I think, listening not just with your ears, but with your entire self." That evening, Clara found Rowan in the library when she came to retrieve a book for Nell. The single lamp in the corridor cast their shadows long across the room, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "Eleanor tells me you have a mind for the estate's challenges," he said quietly. "She suggests, with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, that you would make a more effective steward of Harrowby than any man she has yet known." Clara smiled, despite herself. "Eleanor is becoming a dangerous ally for anyone within this house." "She has always been dangerous," Rowan said, "in the way that truth-telling is dangerous. But I think, since your arrival, she has become something else, hopeful. She believed she would be alone here for the entirety of her life. Now she has begun to imagine that loneliness might not be permanent. Is that her observation or yours? Clara asked. Both, he said, which perhaps means they are the same thing. Eleanor has always understood me better than I understand myself. The space between them, physical and emotional, seemed to contract and expand simultaneously. Clara felt the weight of his gaze, the careful distance he maintained, and beneath it, the strain of maintaining that distance. The wedding night approaches, he said finally. The matter your father asked me to tell you. I think it is time you knew. Her breath caught. Tonight? No, he said. Not tonight, but soon, when you are ready. As she left the library that evening, Clara understood that readiness was not something that would arrive fully formed. It would come as a series of small moments, conversations in the morning room, Nell's honesty, the Duke's careful attention, until one day she would find that trust had been built, not all at once, but brick by brick, moment by moment, truth by truth. Winter deepened, and with it came the social season that even a remote county estate could not entirely escape. Invitations began arriving, tentative at first, as though the parishes were testing whether the scandal had truly been resolved, then with increasing confidence as Clara proved herself to be exactly what her father's letter had promised, a woman of education, composure, and genuine kindness. It was one such invitation that created the first genuine tension between Clara and Rowan. The Ashworth Ball, Clara read aloud, studying the card with its elaborate calligraphy. They have asked specifically that we attend. It is quite prominent, the largest gathering of the season. We shall decline, Rowan said immediately, not looking up from the estate accounts before him. Why would we decline? Clara asked. Your attendance would silence any remaining whispers about the legitimacy of our marriage. Surely the benefit— I do not attend social gatherings, he interrupted, his tone making clear that the discussion was closed. But Clara, emboldened by weeks of increasingly genuine conversation, did not accept the dismissal. You attended the parish assembly 2 months ago, she pointed out. You stood in the ballroom for nearly 3 hours while Canon Slade's wife played the pianoforte. That was a matter of obligation and necessity, Rowan said coolly. The Ashworth Ball is neither. It is an opportunity, Clara said quietly, to present ourselves as a married couple who are comfortable in society. It is an opportunity to demonstrate to everyone who watched our wedding with suspicion that this union, whatever its origins, has become a source of stability rather than scandal. Rowan set his pen down with deliberate precision. You are asking me to perform at a public spectacle. I am asking you to be my husband in more than name and private conversation, Clara replied, and the words were out before she could consider their full weight. I am asking you to trust me enough to face the world together rather than from behind your walls. The silence that followed was profound. His fingers found that place on his signet ring, and his jaw tightened. The Ashworths are not known for their discretion, he said finally. They traffic in gossip as their primary currency. They will look at you, at us, and they will construct narratives regardless of what they observe. I do not wish you to be subjected to such scrutiny. I have already been subjected to it, Clara said. My entire life has been scrutinized. The difference now is that I need not endure it alone. It was perhaps the most direct challenge she had ever offered him, and she watched it land with something like regret for its necessity. I will consider it, he said finally, and returned to his accounts. The decision, when it came 3 days later, was delivered with characteristic brevity. We will attend the Ashworth Ball. You may order a gown if you wish. The gown became unexpectedly a matter of significance. Clara had always dressed practically, with an eye toward durability and respectability rather than beauty. But in the weeks before the ball, she found herself imagining something different, a dress that did not merely conceal her, but presented her to the world as someone worthy of being seen. It was Nell who discovered her standing in the morning room, studying a fashion journal with an intensity that suggested she was attempting to solve a mathematical theorem. You are thinking of the ball, Nell observed, settling beside her, and you are thinking that what you wear matters more than you wish it to. I am thinking, Clara admitted, that I wish to make him proud. I wish to stand beside him in that ballroom and have people see not a woman trapped in a marriage of convenience, but someone who has chosen to be his partner. You could do that in sackcloth, Nell said, but I understand what you mean. You wish the outside to match what you have become inside. I think His Grace would appreciate knowing that such an effort has been made. In the end, Clara chose a gown of deep emerald silk, with ivory lace at the collar and cuffs, formal enough for the occasion, but with a richness of color that suggested not duty, but the confidence of a woman who had begun to claim her own presence. The night before the ball, Rowan requested that she come to the library once more. She found him standing before a portrait, a young woman with eyes that echoed the architectural line of his own, dressed in the fashion of 30 years prior. "My mother," he said, though she had not asked. "She died when I was 9. She was a woman of considerable strength, though she expressed it through very conventional channels. I mention this because tomorrow night, when we stand before the Ashworths and their guests, I want you to know that I am bringing you into a world that has been closed to me since her death. I do not do this lightly." Clara moved to stand beside him. "Why are you doing it?" "Because you asked," he said simply. "And because you were right. The world outside these walls will judge us regardless. It might as well judge us standing together." He turned to face her then, and his hand, tentatively, as though crossing a boundary he had not crossed before, reached out and touched her cheek. The gesture was brief, almost reverent, and when he withdrew, she felt the absence of it, like a small loss. "The emerald is a good choice," he said quietly. "My mother's favorite color was emerald as well." The Ashworth ball unfolded exactly as Rowan had predicted and feared, with merciless scrutiny, barely concealed curiosity, and the kind of speculative attention that transforms human beings into social puzzles to be solved. Clara felt it the moment they entered the ballroom. Hundreds of eyes adjusting their focus, conversations pausing mid-sentence, fans stilling in delicate hands. The Duke and Duchess of Harrowby, the marriage of duty and mystery. The woman without dowry, and the man without evident reason for marriage. But Rowan's hand was steady beneath her gloved palm. He moved through the ballroom with the unself-conscious grace of a man who did not require anyone's approval to exist, and by extension he seemed to offer Clara that same permission. They were intercepted almost immediately by the Ashworths themselves, a couple of considerable wealth but limited intelligence, whose primary occupation seemed to be the collection of gossip as though it were precious art. "Your Grace, Mrs. Harrowby," Mrs. Ashworth gushed, her fan moving in agitated circles. "What a delightful surprise to see you at such a prominent gathering. We were not certain whether rural tastes might find our little assembly to their preference." "The assembly is charming," Clara replied with a composure that seemed to surprise their hostess. "Though I confess the drive from Harrowby House was somewhat arduous. The roads are not yet fully clear of winter." "Such dedication to society's expectations," Mrs. Ashworth said, and there was something almost predatory in her smile. "I understand your marriage was quite sudden, my dear." "A whirlwind romance?" "A matter of familial obligation," Clara said, and she felt Rowan's hand contract fractionally. "My late father arranged it, with his Grace's gracious acceptance. I am quite satisfied with the arrangement. It was a masterwork of deflection, offering truth while revealing nothing of the emotional complexity beneath it." Mrs. Ashworth looked briefly disappointed that her insinuation had not yielded scandal, then pivoted to Rowan with aggressive charm. "His Grace must find rural life somewhat dull," she ventured. "We had heard you were a man of minimal social appetite, sir. Has Mrs. Harrowby reformed you?" "I have merely discovered," Rowan said, his voice carrying the cutting edge it sometimes held, "that some occasions warrant departure from precedent. This is one of them." The conversation concluded shortly thereafter, leaving Mrs. Ashworth with the vague sense that she had been dismissed, though she could not quite identify how it had happened. As the evening progressed, Clara began to understand that Rowan's discomfort in society was not born of shyness or social inadequacy, but rather a profound impatience with the artifice that ballrooms demanded. He was perfectly capable of the rituals. He simply found them tedious. When they took to the dance floor for the opening waltz, she discovered that his restraint extended even to physical proximity. He maintained a formal distance, his hand placed correctly at her waist, but without pressure, as though he were afraid that anything more intimate might transgress some boundary he had set. "You are dancing as though I am made of porcelain," she said quietly, beneath the cover of the orchestra's volume. "I am dancing as propriety demands," he replied. "The entire ballroom is watching us. Every gesture will be interpreted. I will not give them cause to question your virtue." "My virtue is not so fragile as to require such careful management," Clara said. "Hold me as though you meant it. Let them see that we have moved beyond obligation." He was silent for a moment, and then his hand shifted, not dramatically but genuinely, and he drew her closer. The change was subtle enough that no observer would have noted scandal, but it transformed the dance into something else entirely. It became, in that moment, a statement. "This woman is mine by choice. After the waltz, they found themselves in a quieter room, a library of the Ashworth estate, much smaller and less impressive than their own, but offering refuge from the ballroom's relentless observation. "You were magnificent tonight," Rowan said, closing the door behind them. "You moved through that ballroom as though you had been born to it." "I was terrified," Clara admitted, "but I realized midway through Mrs. Ashworth's questioning that she feared me far more than I feared her. She sensed that you had chosen to be here, and that choice conferred a legitimacy upon our union that no amount of gossip could undermine. It was a choice I made for you," Rowan said, "not for myself." "That is perhaps the most honest thing you have ever told me," Clara replied, "and it explains a great deal about the man you are." He was standing near the fireplace, the winter light from the tall windows casting part of his face into shadow. When he spoke again, his voice carried a vulnerability that the formal library at Harrowby had not quite permitted. "Your father's final letter contained more than one request," he said slowly. "It contained a wish that I treat you with respect, yes, and with protection, but it also contained a more personal plea. He asked that I attempt to know you, not merely as the daughter he was leaving behind, but as the woman you were becoming. And he asked that I—" Rowan paused, his fingers finding their familiar place on his signet ring, "that I not mistake obligation for affection, and that if I found myself capable of genuine regard for you, I would tell you so honestly." Clara's breath seemed to pause in her throat. "And have you," she asked quietly, "found yourself capable of such regard?" "I ceased being capable of regarding you merely as obligation," Rowan said carefully, "approximately 4 weeks after our marriage. What began as duty has become something that I can only describe as a choice I make daily, and with increasing gratitude. It was not a declaration of love, not yet, but it was a bridge between the coldness that had preceded it and something warmer, truer, more genuine than mere affection. Then I believe," Clara said, moving toward him, "that we are approaching readiness for what you promised to tell me." The journey home from the Ashworth ball occurred in a carriage suspended between the cold world outside and the warmth generated by something finally acknowledged between them. Clara sat across from Rowan, as propriety demanded when servants were present, but the distance was no longer isolation. It had become intentional, a restraint they both chose rather than a barrier imposed. The days that followed took on a quality of anticipation that manifested in small ways. Rowan began appearing in the morning room with sketches of projects for the estate's spring restoration. Clara, in turn, began offering opinions that he not merely received, but genuinely considered. Nell sensed the shift immediately and took to following them from room to room with the intensity of a child who understood that something significant was approaching. "You are nervous," she observed one afternoon, having cornered Clara in the garden, a winter garden, all skeletal branches and frost-hardened earth. "You move differently now. You hold your shoulders higher. That is what happens before important things." "Eleanor," Clara said gently, "some conversations between adults must remain private, even from very observant children." "I know," Nell said, though her expression suggested that knowing this and accepting it were entirely different matters. "But I wanted to tell you something because after tonight I think everything will be different, and I wanted to say it before that happens." "Say what, my dear?" "That I am glad you came here," Nell said simply. "I was afraid of the big house and the quiet, and of His Grace being sad all the time. Now the house is less empty. The quiet is different. It is peaceful instead of lonely. And His Grace is still serious, but he is not sad anymore. You did that, and I wanted you to know that I see it, even though I am not supposed to understand such things." Clara knelt down and embraced the child, and felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. That evening, as the household settled towards sleep, Clara found a note beneath her chamber door, written in Rowan's careful hand. "Come to the library when you are ready. There are things yet to be said, and I find I can no longer bear to delay them." She changed into a dressing gown of deep blue wool, practical rather than seductive, but with the quality of sincerity that her other garments carried. The corridors of Harrowby House were dark, except for the single lamp that burned in the long passage, and as she walked toward it, Clara thought of all the nights this lamp had borne witness to the household's quiet struggles. Rowan was standing before the fireplace when she entered the library. He had loosened his cravat and removed his waistcoat, presenting an informality that the formal spaces of the house had not permitted before. The letter, her father's letter, the one that had started everything, lay on the desk beside him. "Before I tell you what remains to be told," he began, "I must explain something about your father that may alter your understanding of him. He was dying, yes, But he was also in his final months remarkably lucid about the world and the vulnerabilities it contained. He understood that you were intelligent and capable, but he also understood that intelligence and capability are frequently not enough to protect a woman in this world. "I know this," Clara said softly. "What you may not know," Rowan continued, "is that he deliberately chose me not because I was the most prominent man of his acquaintance or the wealthiest, but because he believed me to be the man most capable of protecting you without attempting to remake you. He told me in his final letter that you would likely marry eventually for genuine affection. His wish was simply that you would have the safety to do so from a position of strength rather than desperation." "He believed you capable of releasing me?" Clara asked, understanding the implication. "He believed me capable of honoring you," Rowan said, "which is a different matter entirely. And it is why I have been so careful to maintain distance, to ensure that you never felt trapped by circumstance or obligated by proximity. Your father wanted you to have a choice, a genuine choice, made freely, not under the weight of gratitude or necessity." He moved toward her then, and the distance closed, not dramatically but with the deliberation of a man approaching something precious that might break under careless touch. "And I must tell you," he said, his voice dropping to something close to a whisper, "that having given you that choice, I find I cannot bear the thought of you choosing to leave. I have come to regard you not as my wife in name alone, but as the person I wish to stand beside for the remainder of my life. The wedding night which we have delayed, which you have been dreading, it will not occur as you fear, Clara. It will occur as an affirmation of something already real between us." Clara's breath caught. "You are telling me this now, before—" "I am telling you this now," he said, "because you deserve to know what awaits you, and because I can no longer remain silent about what you have become to me. Tomorrow night, when you come to the wedding chamber, I will complete the promise your father asked me to make. But I am asking you now, in this library where all truth has been spoken, whether you wish to come as his daughter coming to be claimed, or as a woman who has chosen to be with me of her own accord." The single lamp in the corridor seemed to brighten, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The day of the wedding night passed with a strange quality of unreality. The household moved through its routines as though this were any other day, but beneath the surface, everyone seemed to understand that a threshold was being approached. Mrs. Thorne had the wedding chamber prepared with particular care. Fresh flowers, impossible in winter, somehow procured from the estate's carefully tended orangery, clean linens that smelled faintly of lavender, a fire burning steady and warm. Nell appeared at Clara's chamber door as evening settled into darkness, carrying a simple nightdress of white linen with narrow sleeves and a high neckline. "This was your mother's," Nell said, referring to the wife who had died when Rowan was young. "Mrs. Thorne has kept it all these years. She wanted you to have it, but she did not know how to offer it, so I am offering it for her." Clara accepted the nightdress with trembling fingers. It was beautifully made, delicate in a way that suggested genuine love had gone into its creation, not merely obligation. "How did she know?" Clara asked. "Because Mrs. Thorne understands his grace better than anyone," Nell replied. "She raised him after his mother died. She knows that he will not force you, that he will treat you with the care he should have always been permitted to show. She wanted you to wear something that represented that, the tenderness that was never permitted to show before." After Nell left, Clara sat at her dressing table for nearly an hour, her hands folded in her lap. She thought of her father, of the letter he had written in his final days, of his desire that she be safe. She thought of Rowan's careful distance and the cost it had extracted from him. She thought of the walls of Harrowby House and the warmth that had slowly begun to inhabit its spaces. When midnight approached, a knock came at her chamber door. Rowan stood in the corridor, still in his evening clothes, his cravat properly tied, his waistcoat buttoned as it always was. If he had chosen to present an aspect of formality, it was perhaps as mercy, a way of allowing her dignity rather than meeting her in dishabille. "Are you prepared?" he asked quietly. "No," Clara answered honestly, "but I am willing. That must suffice." They walked together to the wedding chamber, a room she had not yet been permitted to enter, located in the east wing of the house, overlooking the moors. It was austere in its way, but not cold. The fire that burned on the hearth had been allowed to achieve a mellow warmth, and the single lamp, always the single lamp, that faithful witness to the household's truth-telling, cast gentle shadow. "I have waited for this moment," Rowan said, closing the door behind them with a soft click that seemed to seal something beyond mere physical space. "Not because I desired to claim you, but because I wished for you to be ready. Your father's final letter, the one I have kept separate from all others, contained instructions for this night. He wished me to tell you something that he could not tell you himself. Clara's heart moved in an irregular rhythm. What could he have wished to tell me? Rowan moved to a small desk in the corner of the room, a place she had not previously noticed, and withdrew a letter in her father's hand. The wax seal was unbroken. He asked that I give you this, Rowan said, extending it toward her. He asked that you read it alone and that afterward, if you wish to speak of it, we would speak together. But the choice of whether to know what is written here, that remains yours. With trembling fingers, Clara broke the seal. The letter was brief, written in her father's careful physician's hand, and it contained words that seemed to rearrange everything she understood about her own existence. My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you have come to know a truth that I could not speak aloud while I lived. You are not merely my daughter by blood. You are my daughter by a covenant made before you were born. Your mother was a woman I loved beyond measure, but she could not bear children. We sought through prayer and hope for nearly 5 years, and then, through a grace I did not deserve, a young woman came into our household, good of heart, desperate in circumstance, and through an arrangement that was honorable if unconventional, a child was born. That child was you. You are loved, wholly, completely, irrevocably, not because of blood, but because you were desired and treasured from the moment I knew of your existence. The man I have entrusted with your safety knows this truth. I have asked him to guard it and to allow you to decide whether knowing it changes anything about who you are. I have asked him, above all, to ensure that you are never treated as anything less than a beloved daughter and a woman of complete worth. Live freely, my dearest girl. Live with the courage I always saw in you, and forgive me for leaving you too soon. Clara read the letter twice, 3 times, her vision blurring with tears that were something between grief and revelation, and an unexpected liberation. When she finally lowered it, she found Rowan standing at a careful distance, his expression compassionate but not intrusive. My father knew, she whispered. He knew who I was, and he loved me anyway. He loved me because of who I was. He did, Rowan affirmed. And he asked me to tell you that this knowledge changes nothing about your worth, your place, or your future. You are entitled to grieve the loss of what you thought you understood, but you are also entitled to understand yourself as a woman who was wanted, deliberately chosen and cherished by a man whose love was not diminished by the complicated manner of your beginning. Clara set the letter carefully on the table beside the bed. She looked at Rowan, this austere man who had maintained such careful distance, who had honored her father's dying wishes with a faithfulness that had cost him deeply, and she understood in that moment that the wedding night she had been dreading was not a claiming at all. It was a beginning, a genuine, chosen, voluntary beginning. I wish to stay, she said quietly, not because I am obligated, but because I choose to. Then I am grateful, Rowan replied, beyond the capacity of words to express. He offered her his hand, and when she took it, the distance that had held them apart for so long finally, tenderly, dissolved. The morning light came through the windows of the wedding chamber with a clarity that seemed almost defiant after the long darkness of winter. Clara woke to find herself enfolded in Rowan's arms, an arrangement of intimacy that had arrived so gradually through the night that she could not identify the precise moment when it had shifted from careful distance to genuine closeness. He was still asleep, his face softened by unconsciousness into something almost boyish. The severe lines that habitually framed his features had relaxed, and she found herself studying him with the intensity of someone examining a beloved object that had been locked away and finally revealed. The night had not unfolded as society taught women to expect, with demands and claims and the assertion of masculine prerogative. Instead, it had been a conversation conducted primarily in silence, punctuated by whispered words and the careful negotiation of 2 people learning each other's boundaries and desires. When Rowan had finally drawn her close, it had been with a tenderness that suggested the restraint he had maintained for weeks had been born not of indifference, but of profound regard. By the time the household stirred into wakefulness, Clara had returned to her own chamber, a gesture of discretion that seemed to please Mrs. Thorne, who appeared with breakfast looking less austere than she had in months. His Grace requests your presence in the morning room, madam, Mrs. Thorne said, and there was something almost warm in her tone. I trust you slept well. The question, phrased so carefully, carried the weight of the household's collective curiosity and the older woman's gentle approval. Rowan was waiting beside the fire when Clara entered the morning room, and the sight of him in daylight, rumpled and slightly unsettled, his cravat not yet properly tied, struck her with unexpected force. This was a version of him that few had been permitted to see, a man rather than a title, human rather than duty. "Good morning," he said simply, and the simplicity of it was more intimate than any elaborate greeting could have been. "Good morning," she replied. They sat across from each other as they had dozens of times before, yet something fundamental had shifted. The distance that propriety had required was no longer a barrier but a choice, one they could maintain during daylight and cross when darkness permitted. "The household knows," Rowan said quietly. "Not the details, but they understand that the marriage has been consummated. The implications are significant. Society will view our union differently now." "Is that not what we wished?" Clara asked. "To be viewed as genuinely married?" "It is," he affirmed. "But it also means that expectations will change. There will be assumptions about heirs and future plans. The household will begin to organize itself around the presumption of permanence." "And you fear that assumption?" Clara asked gently. "I fear nothing with you," he said, and the simplicity of the statement carried a truth that seemed to surprise him even as he spoke it. "But I wished for you to understand the machinery that will now begin to move. Society has already acquitted you of impropriety because I claimed you publicly at the Ashworth ball. Now that the marriage is consummated, you have been fully integrated into your role. The whispers will not cease entirely, they never do, but their character will change. You will be viewed as His Grace's Duchess, not as his charity case." Clara felt the weight of this transformation settle upon her. "And what of us? Beyond society's categories?" "That," Rowan said, "is the matter I now reserve entirely for ourselves." The change in the household was subtle but unmistakable. Mrs. Thorne began consulting with Clara about household decisions that previously would have been resolved without her input. The servants, who had maintained a careful distance, began offering her small courtesies, a better seat by the fire, butter brought to table before she asked, the acknowledgement of her presence as something desired rather than tolerated. Nell, however, understood the transformation most completely. "You love each other now," she announced one afternoon, having cornered both of them in the library with the directness that characterized her speech. "Not in the way you loved him before, when you were trying not to, and not in the way he loved you before, when he was trying to hide it. Now you love each other openly. It is much better." "Eleanor," Rowan began, but Nell continued undeterred. "I am glad," she said simply, "because this house was very sad before. It was a house of duty and obligation, and those are important things, but they are not the same as a house where people choose to be together. Now it is both, and that is what makes a home." She left them before they could respond, leaving behind an observation so profoundly true that it seemed to echo through the chamber. 2 weeks after the wedding night, a letter arrived bearing the canon's seal. Rowan opened it, read it with an expression of carefully contained fury, and handed it to Clara without comment. The canon had written to suggest, with the careful phrasing that transformed suggestion into threat, that there were rumors circulating regarding the legitimacy of the marriage. He suggested further that the hasty consummation of the union suggested an impropriety that the publication of her father's letter might have concealed rather than disproven. He offered with honeyed sympathy to conduct a discreet inquiry into the matter. "He is attempting to unravel what we have established," Clara said quietly, reading the words a second time. "He is," Rowan confirmed, "and he will continue to attempt such unraveling for as long as it remains possible. Canon Slade is a man who has built his authority upon the careful manipulation of social fear. Our happiness offends that authority." "What will you do?" Clara asked. "Nothing," Rowan said, and there was something almost peaceful in the resignation. "If we respond, we validate his concerns. If we respond not, we demonstrate confidence in what we have built. Let him write his insinuations to empty air. The only authority that matters, the authority of our own understanding of this marriage, remains ours alone." But Clara understood that this was not entirely true. Society's judgment, however unjust and intrusive, possessed a power that personal conviction could not entirely withstand. The question became not how to silence the canon, that was impossible, but how to make his voice so clearly the voice of a bitter man that others would cease to listen. That evening, as they sat together in the library, Rowan spoke of plans for the spring season. The estate would host a garden party, a statement of confidence and permanence. Invitations would be extended to the county's most prominent families. Clara would preside as hostess. "It is a challenge," he said, but one that will establish you in your role beyond question. Once society sees you as the mistress of Harrowby in full authority, the canon's insinuations will lose their force. And if I fail? Clara asked. You will not, Rowan said with absolute certainty. You are capable of far more than you yet believe yourself to be. He extended his hand to her then, and when she took it, it was no longer a gesture of formal greeting. It was an affirmation of partnership, the kind of partnership that existed not despite difficulty, but because of the courage to face it together. Spring came late to Harrowby, but when it arrived it came with sudden profusion. The gardens that had lain dormant burst into colour, the inheritance of a woman who had loved growing things, tended now by a gardener who had honoured her memory through meticulous care. Roses bloomed red and cream and pale gold. Peonies burst open like secret confessions. The entire estate seemed to exhale a sigh of relief that winter had finally released its grip. The invitations for the garden party had been issued 3 weeks prior, and their reception had been gratifying. Most of the county's prominent families had accepted, curious to see how the mysterious Duchess would conduct herself in a social capacity. Even those who maintained reservations about the marriage found themselves unable to refuse. Attendance had become a social necessity. Clara had thrown herself into the preparations with an intensity that Rowan watched with something approaching wonderment. She consulted with the cook about menus, oversaw the arrangement of furniture in the garden, personally supervised the placement of flowers in strategic locations throughout the grounds. It was not the frantic energy of a woman attempting to prove something, but rather the focused attention of someone who had discovered a gift for organizing beauty and had decided to employ it fully. You have transformed, Mrs. Thorne observed one morning, watching Clara direct the servants in the placement of garden chairs. When you arrived here, I thought you would wilt like an unwatered plant. Instead, you have bloomed. I have been given permission to do so, Clara replied simply. That is not the same as wilting or blooming naturally. It is the difference between a seed planted in stone and a seed planted in soil. The potential was always there. It simply required the right conditions to manifest. Mrs. Thorne studied her for a long moment, and then nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose assessment had been proven accurate. The day of the garden party arrived clear and bright, the kind of spring day that felt like a blessing, the sky precisely the shade of blue that reminded one why beauty mattered. Clara had chosen a gown of pale grey silk with white lace inserts, a choice that Nell had approved with the authority of a child who understood the grammar of presentation. "Oh, you look like spring itself," Nell said approvingly. "Serious spring, but spring nonetheless, not frivolous but lovely." Rowan's expression when he saw her confirmed the girl's assessment. His eyes moved across her with the intensity of someone reading a beloved text, and something in his face softened. "You are magnificent," he said simply. "I am terrified," Clara corrected gently, "but I am attempting to appear magnificent while feeling terrified, which I trust will suffice." "It will more than suffice," he assured her. The garden party began at 2 in the afternoon, and the county arrived in careful waves, first the families of highest rank, then those of substantial but secondary standing, and finally those on the social margins who were nonetheless invited, because propriety and Christian charity demanded it. Clara received them all with a grace that seemed to come from some reserve she had not previously known she possessed. She spoke to the Ashworths with cordial composure, entirely refusing to acknowledge Mrs. Ashworth's probing questions about her health and well-being, with the implication that any deterioration in appearance might suggest pregnancy. She engaged the wives of physicians and solicitors with genuine interest in their charitable work. She even managed to draw out the wives of merchants whose social standing was perpetually uncertain by asking about their families with authentic curiosity. Rowan remained nearby but not hovering. He introduced her to those she had not yet met, stood beside her during conversations of particular complexity, and generally conducted himself as a man who had complete confidence in his wife's ability to navigate this world. The message was subtle but unmistakable. This woman is here because I chose to place her here. This woman represents my judgment and my values. By mid-afternoon, the dynamic had shifted perceptibly. Those who had arrived with gossip in their hearts had been disarmed by Clara's evident composure and genuine kindness. Those who had harbored doubts about the marriage's legitimacy found themselves viewing it instead as a union that, while unconventional in origin, had become stable and apparently affectionate. Canon Slade appeared, having invited himself with the impunity of a man accustomed to believing his presence was always desired. He arrived after the majority of guests, carrying his small social authority like a weapon barely sheathed. "Your Grace, Mrs. Harrowby," he said, inclining his head with a courtesy that did not quite reach his eyes. "What a delightful gathering. The parish is quite consumed with admiration for the Duchess's management of this occasion." "How kind of the parish to concern itself," Clara replied, her tone pleasant but distant. "We are grateful for their interest in the estate's welfare." Of course, the canon said, though some have wondered whether such extensive social engagement is quite appropriate given certain circumstances of the marriage's origin. "The marriage's origin," Rowan interjected, his voice carrying a note of quiet authority, "is a matter of complete legitimacy, as was established through the publication of her late father's letter. If there remain those in the parish who question that legitimacy, Canon, I would suggest they consult their conscience regarding the Christian virtue of accepting another's word as their bond." The canon's face flushed slightly. "I intended no offense, Your Grace, merely observing that—" "I understand precisely what you intended," Rowan interrupted. "The matter is concluded. Now, if you will excuse us, the Duchess and I must attend to our other guests." He took Clara's arm, and they moved away with a smoothness that suggested perfect coordination. Once they were out of earshot, Clara found herself trembling slightly. "He will not stop," she said quietly. "No," Rowan agreed, "but this afternoon has demonstrated something important. Society no longer listens to him with the attention it once did. Your presence here, your management of this gathering, your evident competence and grace, these things matter far more than his insinuations. The canon is becoming white noise, Clara. That is not a permanent silencing, but it is something." As evening approached and the guests began to depart, Clara found herself standing alone in the garden, watching the last light touch the roses with gold. Rowan found her there and took her hand without speaking. "You were magnificent today," he said finally. "I was terrified," she replied. "Yes," he agreed. "But that is where true courage exists, not in the absence of fear, but in the choice to act despite it." They stood together as darkness settled, and somewhere in the house, a servant lit the single lamp in the long corridor, bearing witness to another day survived, another step forward taken. The transformation of Harrowby House, once the wedding night had been consummated and Clara's role had been publicly affirmed, was remarkable not in its dramatic gestures, but in its accumulation of small mercies. Rooms that had been closed were opened. Furniture was rearranged. The servants moved with a lightness that suggested the weight they had been carrying had finally been set down. It was Nell who articulated this change most clearly. "The house is happy now," she announced one morning, appearing at the breakfast table with her usual disregard for proper timing. "It sounds different. When I walk the corridors at night, I do not hear the sadness anymore. I hear expectation, as though the house is waiting for something good to happen next." "Houses do not hear or feel, Eleanor," Rowan said, but there was no rebuke in his tone. "This house does," Nell insisted, "because it contains people who love each other, and love is not silent. Love changes the shape of silence. When you and His Grace were not yet together, the silence was empty. Now it is full." Clara found herself looking at Rowan, and in his expression was the kind of tenderness that Nell's observation had provoked, the recognition that the child had named something true about the machinery of human emotion and its power to reshape the spaces they inhabited. The weeks that followed brought changes in the household structure that Clara had not anticipated. Mrs. Thorne, approaching the age when retirement would soon be inevitable, began training Clara in the intricate hierarchies and histories that management of such an estate required. She spoke of the servants who had been with the household for decades, of their particular strengths and the careful touch required to lead them. She spoke of the financial matters that a proper duchess should understand, of tenant relations, and the delicate balance between firmness and mercy. "His Grace is a good man," Mrs. Thorne said one afternoon, as they reviewed the household accounts together. "But he is a man shaped by duty rather than by pleasure. You have the capacity to teach him the duty, and pleasure need not be opposing forces. You must use that capacity wisely." "Are you advising me on how to manage my husband, Mrs. Thorne?" Clara asked, not unkindly. "I am," the older woman replied without hesitation, "because I raised him, and I know his limitations better than anyone. He will not always understand what he needs until you show him. That is not weakness. It is simply the consequence of his upbringing. Be patient with him, madam. He is learning, as are you. But his learning is more difficult because it requires unlearning the cost of his earlier education. This conversation stayed with Clara, coloring her understanding of the small moments that accumulated between her and Rowan. When she found him reading poetry late at night and deliberately did not comment on it, allowing him the privacy of his own quieter self. When she arranged for Nell to have more time with him, recognizing that the child was his primary teacher in the language of unguarded emotion. When she chose sometimes to sit in silence beside him, rather than fill the space with conversation, understanding that silence could be companionship rather than isolation. A month into spring, a letter arrived from London, from a solicitor representing the disposition of her father's estate. Clara had assumed everything had been settled, but it appeared there was a secondary holding she had not been aware of, a small house in the countryside, left in trust for her with explicit instructions that it should be available to her as a place of retreat and reflection should she ever require it. Your father was quite thorough, the solicitor had written. He wished you to have a space entirely your own, separate from any husband's authority or control. The house is modest but beautiful, situated on the edge of the Lake District. Should you ever wish to claim this inheritance, the trust is established in perpetuity for your benefit. Rowan read the letter over her shoulder and made no move to suggest she should renounce the inheritance or place it under his management. It is a gift born of love, he said quietly. Your father wished you to have absolute agency, even in marriage. That was extraordinarily wise of him. You should know that you possess this recourse, this place of refuge should you ever require it, though I hope you will never need to. It is not about needing to, Clara said, understanding something fundamental as she spoke. It is about knowing I could. That knowledge changes everything. It means my presence here is entirely voluntary, not because I lack alternatives, but because I choose you above any alternative. I know, Rowan said, and there was gratitude in those two words that seemed to encompass months of careful distance, finally transformed into chosen proximity. One evening, Nell brought them news that reframed their understanding of the canon's diminishing influence. I heard the servant speaking, she reported, as was her custom. Canon Slade has been invited to dinner at the Ashworth's house, and Mrs. Ashworth has asked him specifically to explain his concerns about the marriage. He is becoming defensive about his insinuations. Apparently, several families have suggested that his continued questioning of His Grace's honor is itself dishonorable. Society has standards, Rowan said dryly, but they are not the standards one might hope for. Still, if the canon is being questioned by his own social peers, his power is genuinely diminished. This is progress. As May arrived with its profusion of green, Clara began to understand that the real victory was not in the silencing of external voices, but in the building of something internal, a marriage that had moved beyond the categories society imposed and had become genuinely her own. She was no longer the poor bride forced into advantageous circumstance. She was not the woman being claimed by a title. She was simply Clara, Duchess of Harrowby, a woman who had chosen to be present in this house with this man for reasons that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with love. Summer began to touch the moorlands with warmth and the first suggestion of permanence that spring had not quite dared to promise. It was during one of those warm evenings, when the light lingered past dinner and the whole landscape seemed suspended in a kind of golden hesitation before darkness, that Rowan asked Clara to come to the library. She found him standing before a small fire, unnecessary in the warmth but present nonetheless, holding a letter. She recognized immediately that this was not a new correspondence, but something old, something that had been kept in careful preservation. Your father wrote me multiple letters, he said without preamble, 3 in total over the course of the months before his death. This is the final one, and it contains the last of his requests. I have kept it until now because I wanted to ensure that you had achieved a genuine understanding of your own agency before revealing what is contained herein. Clara's heart began to move in an irregular rhythm. What does it say? It says, Rowan began, moving toward her with the letter held carefully, that your father knew he was dying, and he knew he was dying without having given you certain information that he believed you had the right to possess. The information concerns your birth, your legitimacy, your place in the world, but it also concerns something else entirely. He handed her the letter. The handwriting was her father's, but shakier than she had ever seen it. The hand of a man writing in pain or near the end of his strength, or both. My dearest Clara, it began, this letter is written with the full knowledge that I am dying, and with the prayer that I will have the opportunity to speak with you myself before I go. If you are reading this instead, it means my prayer was not granted, and I must entrust to Mr. Rowan Harrowby the transmission of a truth that I have carried for nearly 20 years. Clara's breath caught. You were born not to me, and the woman I told you was your mother, but to another. The circumstances of your birth were complex, and they were arranged with honor, but they were nonetheless arranged. I have told you this, and I trust that Rowan has allowed you to come to peace with this knowledge. But there is more. The woman who bore you, who gave you birth and then gave you to me, was a woman I loved as a sister loves a brother, without the complications of romantic attachment. She came to me in desperate circumstance, and I offered her shelter and honor. When you were born, she made a choice that broke her heart. She decided that your future would be better served in my keeping than in hers. That choice required a courage I do not possess, and it was made with the full understanding that she would never know you. She is living, Clara. I mean to ensure, if it is possible before I die, that she knows you are well, that you are loved, that her sacrifice was not in vain. If I do not accomplish this, I am asking Rowan to do so. I am asking him to find her, to give her a letter I have written, and to tell her if she wishes to know that her daughter has become a woman of extraordinary worth. The choice of whether to know her, whether to establish any connection with her, must remain entirely yours. I am not asking you to forgive her or to feel any particular way about her. I am simply asking you to know that you were born of love, however complicated and difficult that love was. And I am asking you to know that the woman who bore you made the most difficult choice of her life in order to give you this life. Clara lowered the letter. Her vision blurred. Your father, Rowan said quietly, gave me her name and the last direction where he knew her to be. I have taken the liberty of locating her. She is living in Cornwall as a widow, and she teaches music to young women of modest means. Her life appears to be one of quiet honor and genuine service. But I wish to ask your permission before I made any contact with her on your behalf. Did you think I would wish to know her? Clara asked. I thought you might wish to have the choice, Rowan replied. That is what your father was always most concerned with, that you should have genuine choice, not imposed obligation. Clara moved to the window and looked out at the moorlands, now touched with the first golden light of evening. Somewhere in Cornwall, a woman was living her life unaware that her sacrifice had resulted in a daughter who had been loved completely and without reservation. Somewhere in this world, Clara possessed a biological mother, a reality that sat strangely in her consciousness, neither changing what she already was, nor invalidating the love that had shaped her. I would like to write to her, Clara said finally. Not to meet, not yet perhaps, but to write. To let her know that I know and that I am well and that I understand what she gave up. After that, perhaps time will tell what more is possible. I will facilitate this, Rowan said. And Clara, your father's final instruction was that I should tell you he was proud of you. Proud of your strength, your character, your capacity for forgiveness and grace. He carried that pride with him into death. That night, Clara began writing a letter to the woman who had given her life and then relinquished it. It was difficult work, the kind of writing that required her to find words for emotions she had not previously named. But as she wrote, she found something true emerging. The woman in Cornwall deserved to know that her sacrifice had mattered, that her daughter had become someone capable of understanding the courage such a sacrifice required. By the time the letter was finished, it was past midnight, but Rowan was still awake, waiting in the library, and when Clara brought him the sealed letter to forward to Cornwall, he held it with the reverence of something sacred. Your father would have been proud of this, he said simply. And Clara understood that in choosing to write, in choosing to extend compassion to a woman she had never met, she had moved beyond the simple facts of her own story into something larger, a recognition that human hearts carried complexity that could not be easily sorted into categories of right and wrong, and that sometimes the greatest strength lay not in judgment, but in understanding. 6 weeks passed before a response arrived from Cornwall. During that interval, Clara had consciously chosen not to speculate about what answer might come. Instead, she had thrown herself into the practical matters of the estate, overseen the preparation of summer supper parties, and continued the work of establishing herself as a duchess who was something more than a title, a woman who genuinely cared for the welfare of those within her sphere of influence. Rowan, she had noticed, seemed to take particular pleasure in watching her move through these duties. There was pride in his expression when she resolved a dispute between servants with wisdom rather than authority, or when she personally visited a tenant's sick child and returned with practical suggestions for the family's welfare. You have become the mistress of this house in truth, he said one afternoon, as they walked the gardens. Not merely in name or circumstance, but in the way you move through it, the way you make decisions, the way you lead. Your father would have recognized this. Your father, you mean to say, Clara corrected gently, the man who raised me. But when the letter came from Cornwall, it shifted something. The woman who had borne her had written in a careful, educated hand, "My dear Clara, if you have received this letter, it means that your father, the man who chose to raise you and to love you as his own, has finally entrusted you with the truth that I have carried for nearly 20 years. I do not know precisely what he has told you or how you have received the knowledge. But I know that if you are capable of writing to me with the grace evident in your letter, then his raising of you was everything I could have hoped, and nothing I deserve credit for. I will not burden you with the details of my circumstances when you were born, nor will I ask your forgiveness for a choice that was made with full awareness of its cost. What I will say is this: giving you to your father was the greatest act of love I was capable of performing. And reading that you are well educated and capable of such kindness as you have shown in writing to me, this has given me a peace that I did not believe possible. If you wish to know me, I am here. If you prefer that our knowledge of each other remains in these letters, I will accept that with gratitude. But I wished you to know that you were born of a woman who loved you enough to step away from you, and who has prayed for your welfare every single day since." Clara read the letter 3 times before she could speak. "She asks nothing of me," she said finally, looking at Rowan. "She does not demand recognition or relationship. She simply gives me the choice." "That," Rowan said, "appears to be the characteristic of the women in your family. Your father taught you to value choice, and your biological mother has honored that same value in her letter to you." "I think," Clara said slowly, "that I would like to visit her. Not now perhaps, but sometime this autumn when the season permits. I would like to know her, at least to some extent, not as a mother. I have one who raised me and loved me, but as a person, as the woman who made a choice that has shaped my entire existence." "I will accompany you," Rowan said, "if you wish it." "I do," Clara replied. "I wish very much for you to know all the people who have made me who I am." In the weeks that followed, Clara found herself occupied with a kind of quiet anticipation. She continued her work as Duchess, managed the estate, oversaw the household, but beneath it all, she carried the knowledge that somewhere in her extended future, she would have the opportunity to know this woman, not as someone to be forgiven or condemned, but as a person whose difficult choice had been an act of love. One evening, as she and Rowan sat in the library, their library now, this room that had witnessed all the transformations of their strange marriage, she spoke of her father's final letter. "He asked that you find her," she said. "But he also, I think, trusted that you would do so only if it became necessary. He trusted your judgment." "I do not know if I deserve that trust," Rowan said, "but I have done my best to honor it. Your father was a man who understood that love is not always simple, and that the most important gift we can give another person is the freedom to make their own choices." "And have you given me that freedom?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. "I have tried to," Rowan said. "I cannot claim perfect success. I am still a man shaped by duty and restraint. But I am learning slowly that love means allowing someone to be fully themselves, even, perhaps especially, when that self is different from what I might have anticipated." Clara took his hand, and in that simple gesture was the entire evolution of their marriage, from coercion to obligation to choice to genuine partnership. They had not arrived at love because society demanded it, or because obligation required it, but because they had both decided to step across the threshold from necessity into genuine affection. Outside, the summer evening settled into dusk, and somewhere in the house a servant lit the single lamp in the long corridor. It burned steadily, bearing witness to a marriage that had transformed from scandal into substance, from imposed circumstance into chosen love. The canon still sent occasional letters expressing his reservations, but society had moved on, and even the canon's voice was beginning to fade into the background noise of gossip that no one quite bothered to listen to anymore. What remained was the house, alive now with laughter and genuine warmth. What remained was Rowan, finally learning to be something other than merely dutiful. What remained was Clara, fully inhabiting her role as Duchess, while maintaining the agency her father had taught her to value. And what remained was Nell, a child who had learned that loneliness need not be permanent, that love could arrive in unexpected forms, and that families could be constructed from the pieces of broken lives and made whole through the choice to care for one another. Autumn arrived with a sharpness that suggested the year was conscious of its own mortality. The leaves turned from green to gold, to the deep rust of decay, and the moorlands took on a quality of austere beauty that matched the landscape of Harrowby's emotional interior. It was in September, when the household had settled into the comfortable routines of autumn, that Canon Slade made his final attempt at creating scandal. The letter arrived with an official seal, addressed not to Rowan but to the bishop, a deliberate bypassing of ordinary channels that suggested desperation had overcome whatever remaining caution the canon possessed. Rowan read it in the morning room, his expression hardening as he progressed through the pages. "He has formally petitioned for an ecclesiastical inquiry into the legitimacy of our marriage," Rowan said finally, setting the letter on the table with the care one might use in handling something diseased. "He suggests, through careful insinuation, that the publication of your father's letter was a forgery designed to conceal impropriety. He is requesting that the bishop appoint an investigator to examine the matter." Clara felt the old fear rise, but alongside it came something else. Anger, not frantic, but calm and purposeful. "He will not succeed," she said quietly. "No," Rowan agreed, "but the process itself will be unpleasant. There will be questions, investigations into documents, interviews with witnesses. It will be intrusive and humiliating." "Then we must be prepared to endure it," Clara said. "We have done nothing wrong, Rowan. The only shame available here is the shame of allowing this man to silence us through fear." What followed was a careful, methodical refutation of every insinuation the canon had made. Rowan engaged solicitors to examine the documentation of their marriage. The bishop was provided with letters from Clara's father's physician, confirming his terminal illness and his state of mind. Witnesses were identified who could attest to the legitimacy of the published letter. Most importantly, Clara herself submitted to an ecclesiastical interview, during which she answered every question with a clarity and composure that seemed to confound the investigator, who had apparently expected either evasion or defensive anger. When the bishop's final judgment arrived, it was decisive. The marriage was entirely legitimate. The canon's insinuations were without foundation. Moreover, the canon's conduct in pursuing the matter had been deemed unbecoming of a man of his station, and a formal censure was placed in his record. Rowan received the news with a quiet satisfaction that suggested vindication rather than victory. "Society will forget this," he said to Clara. "The bishop's judgment will circulate among the county's important families, and within a season, the canon's voice will be entirely silenced. This is how authority works in our world, Clara. Not through violence or dramatic confrontation, but through the slow, inexorable alignment of power against those who attempt to misuse it." "And Canon Slade?" Clara asked. "Canon Slade will remain in his parish," Rowan said. "He will continue his duties, and he will continue to harbour his resentment, but he will do so in silence, and in the knowledge that if he speaks again, his career will be finished entirely. That is the mercy available in our system. It permits people to survive their own disgrace, if they are willing to accept it quietly." The following weeks brought a noticeable shift in the household's external relationships. Invitations that had previously come with a certain tentative quality now arrived with genuine warmth. Families that had been cautious in their association with Clara now actively sought her company. The tone of society, so fickle and responsive to the judgments of authority, had shifted entirely in her favour. Mrs. Thorne observed this with what might have been satisfaction. "You have been proven correct," she said to Clara one afternoon. "The household sensed it even before the formal judgment, that you were genuine and that His Grace's choice to marry you was sound. Now, the world simply confirms what we already knew." It was during this period of vindication that Clara received a second letter from Cornwall. Her biological mother had written to say that she understood Clara would be travelling to the West Country in autumn, and she would welcome the opportunity to meet in person, if Clara remained willing. "I have lived my life in preparation for the possibility that you might someday wish to know me," she had written. "That possibility is now arriving. I am prepared to meet you as one woman meets another, without expectation or demand, but with the full acknowledgement of what has passed between us." Clara showed the letter to Rowan and watched the careful attention he gave to her emotional response. "When will you go?" he asked. "In October," Clara said. "When the season permits, and before the weather becomes truly difficult. Will you accompany me?" "I would be honoured to," he replied. As September turned toward October, Clara found herself occupied with the quiet anticipation of this meeting. She had built an image of this woman, educated, musical, capable of making impossible choices with grace. But images were not the same as reality, and reality had a way of being more complex and more human than anticipation permitted. What surprised her most was the anxiety that preceded the journey. She had endured so much: coerced marriage, social scandal, the revelation of her unusual birth, yet the prospect of meeting the woman who had borne her and relinquished her seemed to contain a vulnerability that those earlier trials had not required. On the evening before their departure, Rowan found her in the library, reading with the kind of intense focus that suggested she was not actually absorbing the words. "You are afraid," he observed, settling into the chair beside her. "I am," Clara admitted. "What if she is disappointed? What if the reality of knowing me is less bearable than the abstraction of not knowing?" "Both things are possible," Rowan said. "But what is also possible is that you will discover a woman of strength and complexity, and that the two of you will find common ground, born not of obligation, but of genuine recognition. Your father taught you to hope for the best of people while accepting their human limitations. Perhaps you should extend that same courtesy to your biological mother." "When did you become wise?" Clara asked. "I became wise," Rowan said with the faintest hint of amusement, "the day you arrived at Harrowby House and began teaching me that duty and love need not be entirely separate." The journey to Cornwall took 3 days, travelling through countryside that gradually transformed from moorland to something softer, more rounded by wind and sea. The roads became narrower, lined with hedgerows that spoke of ancient boundaries and slow accumulation of history. By the time they reached the coastal town where Clara's biological mother lived, the very air seemed to carry a different quality, salt and possibility mixed together. The house was modest, as the solicitor's letter had indicated, but it possessed a quiet grace. It was situated on a hill overlooking the sea, and the garden, even in autumn's declining state, showed evidence of meticulous care and genuine love. Roses, past their prime, still held dignity in their fading. Herbs that would normally be dying back had been carefully tended. Everything spoke of a woman who believed in the value of small, careful beauty. When Margaret Ashford opened the door, Clara recognized something immediately, not in her features, which bore only passing resemblance to her own, but in her expression. There was the same careful attention to the emotional state of others, the same quality of listening that Clara had inherited from the man who raised her. "Clara," Margaret said simply, and the name in her voice carried the weight of 19 years of longing. "I am so glad you have come." They moved into a sitting room warmed by a fire and furnished with simple elegance. Tea was brought, but for a long moment neither of them knew quite how to begin. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said finally. "I know this must be strange for you." "Everything about my life has been strange," Clara replied, "but not unhappy. My father, the man who raised me, he loved me completely. That is not a small thing." "No," Margaret agreed. "It is not a small thing. It is everything. When I gave you to him, I gave you the one gift I could offer, a home with a man who had the capacity to love you as you deserved to be loved. I have spent 19 years hoping that gift proved sufficient." "It did," Clara said, "and it does." Over the course of the following hours, the two women began the slow work of knowing each other. Margaret spoke of her circumstances, a family of modest means, a man who had promised marriage and then abandoned her. She spoke of the year of her pregnancy, of carrying a child while attempting to hide the fact from the world. She spoke of the moment when Clara's father had offered her not charity, but a solution born of compassion. He would marry a woman of virtue who could not bear children, and Margaret's child would have a home and a name. "It was the only way to protect you," Margaret said, "the only way to ensure you would not carry the shame of my circumstances. If I had kept you, you would have been labeled a bastard, shut out from society, unable to make any respectable marriage. But with him, you were given everything I could not offer." "And the man who would have been my father?" Clara asked. "The one who abandoned you?" "I have not thought of him in years," Margaret said. "He was weak, and weakness in a man is a different kind of cruelty than deliberate harm. But I have thought of you every single day." That night, staying in a small inn in the town, Clara found herself unable to sleep. She had expected many things from this meeting, but not the complexity of genuine affection tempered by complete acceptance of the boundary that both women understood had to exist. The following day, Rowan met Margaret properly. Clara watched as he extended to this woman the same courtesy he might offer to anyone of social standing, while remaining carefully sensitive to the unusual nature of their relationship. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "your daughter is a remarkable woman. I owe a great debt to the man who raised her, for he created the conditions in which her natural capacities could flourish. But I also recognize that you made a choice that preserved her future at the cost of your own comfort. That was an act of genuine sacrifice. Margaret's eyes filled with tears at his words, and she inclined her head with a grace that suggested she had always known what kind of man her daughter had married, even before she knew him. On the final evening of their visit, Margaret brought out a small box. "I kept these," she said. "Letters from your father, updating me on your progress as you grew, drawings you made as a child, a lock of your hair from when you were born. I thought perhaps you should have them, not because they are precious, though they are, but because they are evidence that you were loved before you were born, loved while you were separated from me, and loved continuously by a man who had no obligation to you, except the obligation he chose to take on." Clara took the box with trembling hands, and understood that this was Margaret's true gift, not demanding recognition or relationship, but offering proof that her sacrifice had not been a forgetting, but an active, daily choosing to love from a distance. When they departed Cornwall, Clara carried with her not a new mother. That role had been filled by the man she had buried, but something equally valuable, the knowledge that she had been wanted, that her existence had been considered precious enough to sacrifice for. She had been born of love, even if that love had to express itself through separation. The autumn deepened, and with it came the quiet sense that something significant had shifted in the moral landscape of the household. Rowan, returning from Cornwall, seemed transformed in a subtle but unmistakable way. The careful restraint that had always characterized his bearing had become something different. Not weakness, but genuine ease with his own humanity. He began appearing in the morning room not merely to conduct estate business, but for the simple pleasure of conversation with his wife. More remarkably, he began to change the household's traditions in small but meaningful ways. He instituted a weekly dinner, where not just the prominent families of the county were invited, but also the secondary families, the physicians, solicitors, schoolmasters, and other professionals who had been excluded from formal society gatherings. Clara recognized this as a deliberate statement. The Duke of Harrowby did not accept society's arbitrary hierarchies, and he intended to model a different way of organizing human community. Nell, now beginning to show the early signs of girlhood approaching womanhood, seemed to sense that something fundamental had changed. She began to relax in a way that suggested the careful vigilance she had maintained, the need to monitor the household for signs of danger or unhappiness, could finally be set aside. "He is happy now," she announced to Clara one afternoon, with the authority of someone who had made careful observation. He was never sad exactly, but there was a kind of restraint in his happiness, as though he was not entirely permitted to enjoy things. Now the restraint is gone. He laughs now. I have heard him laugh. "You notice everything, Eleanor," Clara said. "I have had to," Nell replied, "in order to survive in a house where emotions were very controlled, but now I am learning that I can simply be without having to monitor. It is very restful." The transformation of the household was made visible through small gestures that accumulated into something substantial. Rowan began to spend more time in the library reading, not in isolation, but with Clara often present, each engaged in their own work, but sharing the space with a comfort that had required months to achieve. He attended the parish services, not from obligation, but with apparent genuine interest in the spiritual life he was choosing to lead. He began to plan for Nell's education with a particularity that suggested he was thinking not about what society expected of a girl ward, but about what would genuinely serve her development. Mrs. Thorne, observing these changes, seemed to settle into a kind of satisfied retirement. She spent less time managing the household directly, and more time training Clara in the deeper knowledge of the estate, the kind of institutional memory that could only be transferred through patient, loving instruction. "You are becoming the true mistress of Harrowby," she said one afternoon, not in the way that power is typically understood, but in the way that matters most, through genuine care for the people and the place. "His Grace chose well, madam, even if the choosing was born of obligation. Obligation that leads to genuine affection is the best kind of obligation there is." It was in November, as winter began its approach, that Rowan requested the household be gathered in the Great Hall. It was an unusual request, and one that seemed to signal something significant. Clara understood from his expression that this was not a casual summons. The servants assembled with a kind of nervous anticipation. Mrs. Thorne stood at attention. Nell appeared from wherever she had been occupied, her eyes bright with curiosity, and then Rowan stood before them, his bearing suggesting that he was about to say something that required genuine courage. "I have asked you here to acknowledge something that has come to my attention over the past months," he began. "This household has been transformed. Not by decree, not by my authority, but by the genuine presence of a woman who came here under the most difficult circumstances and chose to make this place better rather than merely endure it." Clara felt her face grow warm at the public attention. "Mrs. Harrowby has taught me something that I should have understood long ago," he continued. "She has taught me that true authority is not exercised through distance and control, but through genuine engagement with the lives and welfare of others. She has taught me that a household is not merely a structure of obligation, but a community of people who deserve to be known and valued as individuals. For this teaching, I am grateful, and I wish the household to know that she is not merely the Duchess in name, but the heart of Harrowby in every sense that matters." He turned to Clara, and in full view of the assembled household, he took her hand and raised it to his lips, a gesture of reverence that would be discussed in servants' quarters for years to come. "Thank you," he said, and the two words seemed to contain everything that had passed between them. The household, understanding that they had witnessed something significant, began to applaud, a rare occurrence in a formal household, but one that seemed entirely appropriate. That evening in the library, Clara asked Rowan why he had done it. "Because I wanted you to know," he said, "that the entire household understands what you have brought to this place, and because I wanted you to understand that what you have done matters, not to society, not to the parish, but to the people who inhabit this house every day. That is the only judgment that truly matters." December arrived with the kind of beauty that December reserved for estates capable of affording its full expression. Snow fell early and stayed, transforming the moorlands into something like a painting, all white and grey shadow, punctuated by the deep green of winter foliage. The house itself became a study in contrasts, the austere stone warmed from within by fires and lights, the cold exterior matched by genuine heat inside. Rowan began making plans for Christmas, something he had apparently not done in any meaningful way since his mother's death. He consulted with Clara about decorations, requested that music be commissioned for the carol service, and even, with visible reluctance, approached the matter of gift-giving with something approaching interest. "I am not accustomed to celebration," he told Clara, with a candor that suggested the admission cost him. "My father believed celebration was frivolous. I have largely accepted that belief, but I am beginning to suspect that belief was wrong." "Celebration need not be frivolous," Clara said. "It can be a way of acknowledging that despite difficulty, despite challenge, we have chosen to remain together. That is not frivolous, that is sacred." The house transformed under Clara's direction. Greenery was gathered from the estate, holly and ivy, and pine branches that filled the corridors with the scent of forest and cold air. Candles were placed throughout the house, and on Christmas Eve the entire estate seemed to glow with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with intention. The servants were given the day as holiday, a practice that Rowan had apparently discontinued years before. Mrs. Thorne looked surprised at the announcement, then deeply approving. Even Nell understood that something significant was occurring, that this Christmas was different from previous ones, not in its material elaborateness, but in the sense that everyone present had genuinely chosen to be part of creating it. On Christmas Day, the household gathered in the great hall. A tree had been brought inside, an unusual practice, but one that Rowan had read about and decided to implement. It stood in the center of the room, decorated with simple ornaments and candles that gave it an ethereal quality. Clara had written to her biological mother, inviting her to join them for Christmas. Margaret had written back declining. She understood, she wrote, that there were boundaries that needed to be maintained, and Christmas was a time for families to be fully present to each other. But she had sent gifts, a book of poetry for Clara, a fine watch for Rowan, and a delicate music box for Nell. When the household gathered to open gifts, it was a simple affair, but one laden with meaning. The servants received token gifts that acknowledged their worth. Nell received the music box, which she opened with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. Clara received a ring, not a wedding ring, but a signet ring bearing her family crest, which Rowan had commissioned especially. "It is yours to wear," he said simply. "It is not my seal. It is yours, the seal of the woman who has chosen to be my wife, and who has made this house into a home." Clara put on the ring with hands that trembled, understanding that the gesture was his way of saying something that words alone could not adequately express. "You belong here. You are not dependent upon my goodwill. You are integral to what this place has become." That evening, after the formal celebrations had concluded, Rowan and Clara sat in the library with Nell, and he read Christmas poetry aloud, not in the careful, performative way one might read for an audience, but in the genuine, almost tentative way of a man who was learning to express the softer parts of himself. When he finished, Nell looked up at Clara and whispered, "Do you see? The house is truly happy now. I can feel it in every room." Winter released its grip slowly, reluctantly, as though the earth itself was uncertain about returning to growth. But by late February, the first signs of spring began to emerge, small green shoots from the brown earth, tentative bird song, the lengthening of light that suggested the year was genuinely turning. It was in this season of renewal that Rowan conceived of his plan. He revealed it to Clara not all at once, but through careful preparation that suggested the matter held genuine importance to him. "There is something I wish to do," he told her one morning, as they sat in the morning room with the early spring light touching everything with gold. "Something public, something that will demonstrate, definitively and permanently, that this marriage is not merely legitimate, but genuinely my choosing." "What are you planning?" Clara asked, though something in his expression suggested she might already understand. "A celebration," he said, "on the spring equinox when light and darkness are in perfect balance. I wish to invite the entire county, not just the families of prominence, but everyone. Every tenant, every craftsperson, every person whose life is touched by this estate. And I wish to renew my vows with you in public, before all of them, in a ceremony that acknowledges not obligation, but genuine affection." Clara felt something shift within her, a kind of settling, as though all the tensions of the past months had finally been resolved into something stable and true. "You would do that?" she asked. "I would," Rowan said, "and I wish to do something more. I wish to publicly acknowledge that you are not merely the Duchess by virtue of marriage to me, but you are a woman of genuine authority and wisdom who has earned the respect and affection of everyone who knows you. I wish society to understand that the most valuable thing I possess is not my title, but your presence in my life." The weeks that followed were consumed with preparation. The entire estate was mobilized toward the creation of this celebration. The grounds were prepared to accommodate hundreds of people. Tables were arranged under canvas awnings in case of rain. The village was involved. Bakers prepared food. Musicians were engaged. Flowers were gathered from gardens throughout the county. Clara found herself at the center of these preparations, not directing them but present to them, understanding that this was a moment that would define not just her marriage, but her understanding of herself. She was no longer the young woman who had been forced into marriage. She was no longer even the woman who had learned to accept obligation as the shape of her life. She had become someone who was genuinely chosen, genuinely valued, genuinely integral to the life of a man and a household and an entire community. Nell, watching these preparations, finally spoke to her about what was happening. "He was afraid," the girl said simply, appearing one afternoon with her characteristic disregard for proper timing. "For a long time, he was afraid that loving you would be weakness. I could see it in the way he held himself, like someone carrying something very heavy, but now the fear is gone. Now he is simply happy, everyone can see it." "Does it please you?" Clara asked. "This transformation?" "It pleases me greatly," Nell said, "because it means I no longer have to be the guardian of the household's well-being. I can simply be a girl, and know that the adults around me are capable of caring for each other. That is a gift, Clara. That is a great gift." On the night before the spring celebration, Clara found Rowan in the library, standing before the window that overlooked the moonlit moorlands. "Are you nervous?" she asked. "Terrified," he admitted. "I am about to stand before hundreds of people and declare feelings that I do not have considerable experience expressing, and yet you are doing it anyway." "I am," he confirmed, "because your father taught me, through his example and his letters, that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it, because you have taught me that vulnerability is not weakness, and because I have come to understand that the most important things, the things that give life meaning, require that we risk ourselves entirely." He took her hand, and in the darkness of the library, with only moonlight and firelight to illuminate them, he spoke words that she had not expected to hear. "I love you, Clara, not because I am obligated to, not because society demands it, but because you have become essential to my existence. You have transformed not just me, but this entire household, simply by choosing to be present in it, with genuine care and intention. Tomorrow, I will say this before everyone, but I wanted to say it first to you, alone, in this room where all our truths have been spoken. The morning of the spring equinox dawned clear and perfect, as though the sky itself had conspired to make this day extraordinary. The temperature was mild, the light was brilliant, and the entire estate seemed to vibrate with anticipation. By noon, hundreds of people had begun to arrive, tenants and their families, village craftspeople, servants from neighboring estates, merchants from the nearest town. The entire social structure seemed to have been deliberately flattened for this occasion. Clara, dressed in a gown of pale green silk with ivory lace, the same color as the new leaves emerging on the trees. Rowan appeared in formal dress, dark coat, white shirt, the signet ring that had belonged to his family for generations. But what struck her most was his bearing. He moved with a lightness that she had never quite seen before, as though some ancient burden had been set down. The ceremony itself was simple. It took place in the gardens, beneath a hastily constructed archway covered with flowering branches. A country vicar, not Canon Slade, was brought to solemnize the renewal of vows. But the remarkable thing was the presence of the entire estate, all standing, watching, bearing witness to what was being declared. When Rowan took Clara's hands, his eyes fixed entirely upon her, and began to speak. His voice carried a quality that silenced even the wind. "I stand before you," he said, addressing not the assembled hundreds but Clara alone, "to acknowledge a woman who came to me under the most difficult circumstances and chose with every moment and every action to make this place and this household better than it was. I stand before you to declare that what began as duty has become genuine affection. What began as obligation has become choice, and what was once a cold house has been transformed into a home." He paused, and his voice dropped to something almost intimate, though it still reached the farthest edges of the crowd. "Clara, I take you not because I must, but because I choose to. I take you freely, with full consciousness of what that choice means. I take you as my wife, my partner, my deepest companion. Before all these witnesses, I declare that you are not the wife of duty or circumstance, but the wife of my genuine and freely given affection." There was a moment of profound silence, and then the assembled household, the estate, the village, all those gathered began to applaud, not the polite, restrained applause of formal society, but genuine, heartfelt approval that seemed to come from a place of authentic understanding. Clara had prepared words for this moment, but when she attempted to speak them, she found that only truth was available to her. "I came to this house," she said, her voice clear and steady, "believing myself to be a woman of no value in the world's eyes. I was being given to you as a solution to an impossible situation. But you chose to treat me not as a charity case or a burden, but as a person worthy of respect and genuine care. You taught me that my worth was not dependent upon my circumstances or my fortune, but upon my choices and my character. Before all these witnesses, I declare that I choose this man not out of obligation or gratitude, but out of genuine love. I choose him with full knowledge of who he is, and with the intention of building a life with him that honors both of us." The moment seemed to extend beyond time. When Rowan drew her close and kissed her, not in the restrained manner demanded by propriety, but in a manner that expressed genuine affection, the crowd erupted in cheers. As the celebration continued throughout the day, with food and music and dancing on the green, Clara found herself aware of something fundamental having shifted. The rumors that had plagued their marriage had been silenced, not through formal judgment, though that had come, but through this public declaration of genuine affection. Society did not have the power to create or destroy what existed between them, but it had the power to acknowledge and affirm it. As evening approached and the lanterns began to be lit throughout the grounds, Nell found Clara watching the transformed landscape. "The house will be truly happy now," she said with satisfaction. "Everyone knows that you chose each other. That cannot be taken away or questioned. It is real." And it was true. What had begun as coercion, what had evolved through obligation and careful distance, had finally transformed into something that could not be threatened by external judgment. It had become a genuine partnership, freely chosen and publicly declared, standing as testimony to the possibility of redemption and transformation. Word count, 950 words. Epilogue, the year that followed. The autumn following the spring declaration brought a different quality to Harrowby House, one of consolidation and genuine peace. The estate had moved through the seasons marked not by crisis or challenge, but by the quiet satisfaction of people who had learned to be present to each other with genuine intention. Clara had discovered herself to be with child in early summer, a fact that she had revealed to Rowan with a combination of joy and lingering anxiety. The anxiety, she had understood, came from old fears about whether her place in his life was truly secure, whether motherhood might somehow diminish her in his eyes. His response had been immediate and absolute. He had held her and wept, and when she had asked why, he had simply said, "Because we are creating life together. Because you are giving me a future I did not believe I deserved." The pregnancy had not been difficult. Clara had moved through the months with a growing sense of rightness, as though her body was simply expressing what her heart had already understood, that she belonged here, that she was permitted to create life, that she was genuinely wanted. Margaret, Clara's biological mother, had visited twice during the months leading to the birth. The visits were not uncomfortable, but they were marked by careful boundaries. Margaret understood that she was not to be confused with the role of mother. Clara had never called her by that title, and both women understood why. But what had emerged was something equally valuable, a relationship of genuine affection and respect, with each woman understanding and honoring the particular role the other played in Clara's life. "You are happy," Margaret had said during her final visit, observing Clara move through the halls of Harrowby. It was not a question. "I am," Clara had confirmed, "more happy than I believed possible." "Your father, the man who raised you, would be proud," Margaret had said. "He would be proud of all of it. The marriage, the household, the life you have built. He knew when he died that he was entrusting you to someone worthy." The child came in November as the year was turning toward winter, a daughter, with her father's determined expression and her mother's clear grey-green eyes. Rowan had held her with a kind of reverent care that suggested he understood this child to be a miracle that had arrived against considerable odds. They named her Eleanor, in honor of the girl who had been the household's moral compass, and who would now have a younger sister to guide through the world. Nell, now 15 and beginning to reveal the woman she would become, had accepted her new role with the kind of grace that suggested the girl had always understood what her function in the household would ultimately be, not to be the child of the house, but to be the bridge between the broken past and the healed future. She was Rowan's ward, yes, but she had also become the older sister, the mediator, the living proof that broken families could be repaired through genuine care and intention. The canon had finally departed the parish in early spring, having apparently decided that his authority was permanently diminished in a place where the Duke and Duchess had demonstrated such public commitment to each other. He had taken a position in a distant county, and life in Harrowby returned to its natural rhythm without the constant weight of his judgment. Mrs. Thorne had retired to a cottage on the estate, a gesture of gratitude that Rowan had made on Clara's urging. The older woman had shaped a generation of Harrowby House, first the Duke, then the Duchess, and she deserved to live out her remaining years in the comfort that her decades of service had earned. On a winter evening, with the fire burning and the child asleep in her cradle beside them, Rowan and Clara sat in the library, their library, this room that had witnessed every significant transformation of their marriage. "You have given me my life back," he said quietly, not by any dramatic gesture, but simply by choosing to be present in it with genuine care. "When you arrived here, I did not believe I was capable of being loved. You have taught me that I am capable of far more than I believed. And you gave me my freedom," Clara replied. "You could have claimed the authority that tradition and circumstance offered you, but instead you chose to respect my agency. That is rarer than you might understand." He took her hand and they sat in silence. The kind of silence that had come to characterize their relationship, a silence that was companionable rather than isolating, that contained within it all the words they did not need to speak because they had already been spoken through action and presence and genuine care. Outside, the winter wind moved across the moorlands, and somewhere in the house, a servant lit the single lamp in the long corridor, the lamp that had borne witness to every transformation of Harrowby House, from austere duty to genuine love. The marriage that had begun as coercion, that had moved through obligation and careful negotiation, had finally arrived at something that neither of them had quite believed possible when Clara first crossed the threshold of this great grey house. A genuine partnership built on mutual respect, freely chosen affection, and the understanding that sometimes the most important things in life come not from passion or fortune, but from the quiet, sustained commitment to seeing another person clearly, and choosing every day to love them. Their story was not a fairy tale. There had been too much difficulty, too much genuine challenge, too much human messiness for it to be that simple. But it was something perhaps more valuable, It was a story of redemption, of transformation, of two people who had arrived at love not through fate or romance, but through the deliberate choice to honor each other's humanity and build something real together. And that, in the end, was worth infinitely more than any fairy tale could ever offer. This story teaches us something profound about the nature of love, duty, and transformation, a lesson that resonates far beyond the Victorian drawing rooms in which it unfolds. We begin with a reality that would be unspeakable in most contemporary narratives. A young woman is coerced into marriage by circumstance and economic necessity. She arrives at her new home believing herself to be condemned to a life of obligation and emotional isolation. By all logic, this should be a tragedy, and yet it becomes instead a love story. But not because the forced marriage magically transforms into romance, and not because the Duke suddenly overwhelms her with passionate devotion. Rather, it transforms because both individuals choose, deliberately and repeatedly, to transcend the circumstances of their union. The Duke, shaped by a childhood of emotional austerity, chooses to honor the agency of a woman he did not choose. Clara, diminished by poverty and circumstance, chooses to treat her captor with respect and eventually with genuine affection, while maintaining her own integrity and refusing to be remade into something other than herself. This is the true alchemy of their story. They do not overcome their circumstances through fate or luck or the intervention of external forces. They overcome them through the conscious daily choice to see each other as full human beings worthy of respect, care, and genuine affection. The unsealing of letters, the revelation that Clara's marriage had its origin in her father's dying wish, could have been a betrayal. Instead, it becomes an opening because both Rowan and Clara choose to use this knowledge not as a barrier, but as a doorway to deeper understanding. The canon's insinuations and attacks could have destroyed them. Instead, they remain unmoved, not because they are beyond the reach of social judgment, but because they have built something real enough to withstand external assault, a partnership based on genuine regard, rather than the fragile structure of social performance. The revelation of Clara's biological mother could have fragmented her identity or created conflict. Instead, it becomes an expansion. Clara learns that she was born of love, that she was wanted, that her very existence was fought for through sacrifice. This knowledge does not diminish the father who raised her, but rather deepens her understanding of love as something that can take many forms without losing its essential truth. The essential moral, then, is this: true love is not something that descends upon us unbidden. It is not something that excuses us from the hard work of seeing another person clearly and choosing to honor their humanity. True love is something we build, brick by brick, moment by moment, through the conscious choice to act with integrity, respect, and genuine care. The most transformative love is often not the love born of passion at first sight, but the love that develops when two people, especially two people brought together by circumstance rather than choice, decide that they will treat each other with the respect and attention that genuine connection requires. In a world that increasingly valorizes romantic passion as the highest form of love, this story reminds us that something deeper exists, the love that grows when two broken people choose to be present to each other with authentic intention. The love that can transform not just individuals but entire households, entire communities. The love that says, I see you, I value you, I choose you, not because I must, but because you have become essential to my understanding of what it means to be alive. This is the love that matters. This is the love that endures. This is the love worth telling stories about. Dear listeners, if this story of transformation, patience, and the triumph of genuine affection over circumstance has resonated with your heart, we would be deeply honored by your support. Please take a moment to subscribe to the Victorian Romance Audio Stories channel if you have not already done so. Your subscription helps us continue to create these stories of courage, redemption, and the timeless power of love to transform us. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What aspect of Clara and Rowan's journey moved you most? Did you find yourself hoping for their connection to deepen? What lessons about love and commitment does their story hold for you? We read every comment and treasure the engagement of our community. Share this story with friends and family who believe in the power of romance to inspire, challenge, and ultimately transform us. For more stories of Victorian passion, emotional healing, and the triumph of genuine affection, continue with us on this journey. Each story we tell is written with the conviction that love, real love, built on mutual respect and genuine choice, is worth celebrating, worth fighting for, and worth remembering. Thank you for spending this time with Clara and Rowan. Thank you for allowing their story to touch your heart. Thank you for listening to At 19 She Was Forced to Marry the Cold Duke, but on the wedding night he whispered her father's last wish. Presented by Victorian Romance Audio Stories. This story was created with meticulous attention to historical authenticity, emotional depth, and the conviction that love stories matter, not because they provide escape, but because they remind us of our own capacity for transformation and connection. We extend our gratitude to everyone who made this production possible, to our writers and editors, to our narrators whose voices bring these characters to life, to our listeners who trust us with your hearts and your time. May you go forward from this story, understanding that love, true, transformative, real love, is available to all of us. It requires patience, honesty, vulnerability, and the willingness to see another person clearly and choose them deliberately every single day. Until our next story, we remain your devoted friends at Victorian Romance. Audio Stories with gratitude and affection, the Victorian Romance Audio Stories team.